Great to be here today. This is the first podcast of Help Around on the specialty patient journey, and super excited to start this series of very short podcasts, 15 minutes, maybe 20 each, to bring you pharma professionals, brand managers, patient services, anyone thinking about the patient journey when it comes to this new category of specialty medicines and specialty drugs. Um, Bringing you some of the ideas that are going on out there and some best practices when it comes to working in health tech and working with innovative companies. My name is Ishai Knobel. I'm the co-founder and CEO of HelpAround. And due to these crazy times, we are holding this podcast recording today from our virtual studio, which is at home. So we might have, some 4 or 5 year old barging in, yelling something about their Halloween costume, but this is part of the fun. But today, I wanna introduce a great person that honestly any health tech entrepreneur in this space should know. Ameya Phadke, and Ameya works in corporate development at Chiesi Pharmaceuticals. And Ameya has brought multiple partnerships to life with innovative health tech companies. And I'm really excited to have him as our first guest on this series. Ameya, welcome.
Well, I'm really, really excited to be here. I've had the pleasure of seeing this space evolve for several years, and just really excited to talk about this. Just one quick, I think one quick disclosure. Things that I'll talk about, those are really my own opinions, and don't necessarily represent those of the company that I work for. That said, I think it'll be a really fun time, and that allows me to be a little bit more open. But I don't. I'm here speaking only on behalf of myself. I'm not speaking on behalf of my employer or anything like that. But with that out of the way, we can actually get to the fun stuff.
Absolutely. So Ameya, let's talk partnerships. You have put together quite a few partnerships, both as an investor as well as a partner with some pretty innovative companies. I can recall one of the most recent partnerships that you wrote about was with a startup health company, a company called Cyclica, and you wrote a great blog post that I highly recommend about investing during COVID and how partnership really came out of a very authentic relationship and an attempt to help. So I think what I would love to hear from you is at the high level, what is your philosophy on pharmaceutical companies partnering with innovative health tech companies? What's the right way to approach this, and what are some of the common mistakes you see out
So, rather than say pointing fingers at specific practices, I think it would be helpful to talk maybe about what I believe is a helpful mindset the pharma companies can take on when they speak to these companies. Far too often we typically have large, and this isn't just pharma companies, this is pharma, large payer, like large enterprises in general. There tends to be this sort of implied pedestal that the large company is on relative to the health tech company. And so a lot of the conversations are around the health tech company pitching to the large company. And that's sort of the name of the game. One of the things from my perspective, I think the most successful partnerships have really been when the large company has this desire to prove itself to the smaller company, right? So the partnership is not necessarily framed as a large company helping a small company gain some revenue or gain share or bring their product to the market. I actually look at it on its head, right? As a pharma company, when you work with a health tech, that health tech company is helping you evolve your business model. And so the burden is on you to be successful, right? That company could have worked with anybody, but they chose to work with you. And now I know I think in areas where that dynamic and almost that hunger and humility is there up front, those are ones where I think it really makes for a healthy and respectful relationship, right? Like almost like it's a meeting of two equals as opposed to one party sort of being superior and the other party sort of being inferior, if that makes sense. So it sounds very simplistic and very philosophical, but just that one thing, in my view, has been one of the things where I've seen not just partnerships that I may have done or been involved in, both on the tech side, both when I was on the startup side as well as when I'm on the pharma side. But also, if you look at some of the others in the industry that are really, really interesting, it's really where, and granted, I wasn't in the room, but where you could really see almost they're treating each other as equals.
So can you give an example of what that whole piece looks like? Because at the end of the day,
Yeah,
usually the innovator is smaller, is less funded, time urgency is higher, and for very often, if you're dealing with a startup, that's could be the make or break of the company.
yeah.
Whereas on the pharma side, okay, it's one of five, six, seven initiatives
But
that the
that's
brand team is
I'm gonna
pursuing at the
stop.
moment.
I'm gonna stop you there for a second because I think so. From my perspective, as a pharma company, you ideally want to do partnerships that really allow you to punch above your weight class, right? So I think when you enter a partnership, I look at it and say, you want to enter partnerships where if you execute on this, you're a hero, right? Not just for your company, but for your space, massive reward on the back end. And on the flip side, entering partnerships where if it doesn't work out, there's actually going to be some pain on your side. And I know that, the industry gets a knack for being risk averse, but I've found the arrangements where um, there actually is that incentive to succeed because failure is, I wouldn't say failure is not an option, but where there's a significant downside to failure, those are things that I think really help. And from the entrepreneur side, when you're working with a company, sometimes it's a better idea maybe to work with a company that may not be as large as some of the others out there, but is one that's really willing to put real skin in the game. Whether that skin is money on the table, whether that's resource commitment, whether that's a penalty if they don't fulfill their obligations, whatever that is. And so I actually see it as that perspective, right? Like you really want to. So when you're looking at potential partnerships or companies to partner with, large companies, if I'm in the entrepreneur's shoes, I want to partner with the company where my product is foundational, right? And if I fail, there's a lot of pain on their side, even if that may not be the highest revenue account, because especially in the early stage of a company, I would argue that the right partner can make or break a company. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a massively scaling account, but if you get someone that's really vested in your success, that's almost certainly going to be more valuable than someone that may be willing to throw some like innovation fund money at you or something like that.
Okay, so you're talking about really setting up the incentives on both
Yeah,
sides to make sure that everybody has some skin in the game, right? So
exactly.
so
So
both.
splitting the risk, but then also splitting the rewards, right? So if you look at a lot of the models, so it's one of the reasons I actually don't like classic subscription models at all for things like this. I think subscription models are fine for like vendor supply relationships where the product is relatively simple, it fits into a fairly well-defined use case. But if there's going to be a lot of work, for example, if your larger partner needs to do a lot of work, then you want to split the risk and the rewards so that again they have the incentive to help you out. But at the same time, if things don't work out, then there's going to be pain on both sides.
And what have you seen? That's a pretty innovative approach, I would say, to bringing in outside vendors. Very often, the
Maybe
pharma com.
maybe for vendors, but maybe it's because I live in the business development world. That's something that we do all the time, right? When you do a transaction with a company, there's typically a splitting of risk and reward. And so that's something that companies are pharma, if there's one thing they do phenomenally well, it's corporate development, right? And so my view is when you enter these kinds of partnerships, even if the use case itself may be sort of a vendor supplier, thinking around the transaction the way a business development person would actually really helps, right? Thinking around what the use case is, how that boils down to the business case, how you can split the risk, how you can split the reward, and doing that. And because the other thing that's also going to push, when I see partnerships not work out, for the most part, it's because there isn't a clear definition of where one party's obligations end and where the other party's begins, right? So exactly who's responsible for what, and actually carving out really, really, really clear lines of where one party sort of calls the shots and the other part and where the other party calls the shots. So as when you think of this risk and reward, that doing that exercise will also help you understand exactly who does what. Without sort of naming specific companies, one model that I've really, really complimentary about is if you look at a lot of the digital therapeutics deals that some of the players from Japan have entered into, really, really well defined, right? Extremely well defined. What countries, who does what, who's handling what the payouts are. And so, in my view, that's really a good way to look at things. And the reason I'm not naming one specific company because there's a few, several of the pharma companies from Japan have entered into these partnerships, and at least who knows if it'll actually work out. But in my view, they've thought through things in a pretty nice way. Candidly,
So,
far better than what some other players in the industry have.
so why do you think that's the case? Why do you think what are they doing in the way they approach these partnerships? These Japanese companies, how is that really different from the
Yeah,
way American companies approach it?
I don't think it's an American versus a Japanese thing. I think they just, their companies happen to be Japanese. I will say, I think one of the challenges is, there's a lot of this desire um, to show that you're innovative, right? Um, and it's more so amongst larger players than say the mid-level or the smaller players. And maybe so I would say it's probably more a function of size than it is of geography. But I think the larger companies are a lot more exploratory, and more credit to them for doing that. The mid-size and smaller companies tend to approach these partnerships as more traditional in-licensing partnerships, right? The same kind of thinking that they would give if they're in-licensing a classic therapeutic. And so their core businesses tend to be a lot more involved in that, as opposed to sort of the innovation team or the innovation group or what have you. And so having that means that the people that are on the hook to commercialize this are involved in the very beginning. And so that really helps craft a partnership that is not going to be something that you don't have to sell it to the core business because the core business is already sold on it, if that makes sense.
That's a really great point. So when you think about the different stakeholders related to a certain pharma business unit, usually it's around a drug or it's around a
Yeah.
certain therapy, and then you have a few stakeholders there. You have the brand team, you have biz dev, you have patient services,
Yep.
and each company has a different dynamic.
And some
Sometimes it's
companies, right.
contracting,
And some the
sometimes it's market
budgets
access.
exactly. I mean, there's a digital therapeutic CEO, and I wish I could remember who it was because this is like one of the really, really insightful things that I remember hearing at a conference once. And he said, one of the first questions that he asks when he sits down with a prospective pharma partner is, all right, if we do this, whose budget is paying for this, right? Not just is there budget. I mean, that's hopefully a foregone conclusion, or that's hopefully a given. But whose budget actually tells you a lot, right? So it tells you what priority it is. It tells you what the level that is signing off on this. It tells you, what the scope is to broaden this. It tells you how deeply embedded the problem that you're solving is in the company's business model. And so that simple question actually is massively revealing. And if they fumble for that response, that's probably not a great sign either, right? Because that's sort of we'll figure out how to pay for this later. Um, but that's what I've found, right? I mean, I think the partnerships that tend to be, partnerships that may be less exploratory, less bleeding edge, but where the core business is really excited about them from the very beginning. For an industry like pharma, may be a little bit better to take on than say some of the more bleeding edge ones. That's just my perspective, but it's something that I've seen not, you know, and this is sort of at companies, even when I was on the tech side, pharma companies that we worked with, the ones where, they really looked at the product offering as embedded into their core competency. That's really where things took off. And, many of those projects started very small, but scaled really rapidly, right? As opposed to the others where they sort of stayed where they were and then just sort of died as innovation initiatives. So qualification, it's really key.
So qualify and make sure that the core business is going to get an impact and has skin in the game in this
Yeah.
potential innovation. And that otherwise it may just be a long route circle conversation that
Yeah.
may not end up in anything.
I mean, yeah, this is going to sound crazy, but from a philosophical perspective, I believe that anyone in an innovation type function or in a digital health type function, their ultimate goal should be that those activities should be obsoleted by what they're working on, right? So, and like, for example, we don't talk about e-commerce anymore. It's just commerce, right? And so what I mean by that is if you brought in the right kinds of innovation, the day that innovation stops looking innovative, it's because it's become ingrained into the actual processes at that company, which is really what you're shooting for, right? That's how you make maximum impact. Um, and so, that's really how you can keep yourself, on the bleeding edge. So instead of saying fixated on specific technologies like AI, quantum computing, blockchain, or whatever, I think focusing on how you can take things that are outside but actually instead of bringing them in as innovation projects, figure out how to make them sort of more sustainable, right? I mean, I believe
So,
this. I was going to
yeah.
say, I think this industry has way too many innovators and not enough executors.
So let's talk about execution. Let's say that you're in let's say that you're gonna eventually work yourself out of a role. There will be no innovation world. You're just gonna do corporate development,
Well,
no innovation.
right, exactly,
And
right.
exactly, and you're just gonna be buying companies all day long, hopefully, and the or investing, and let's say that this role of it will be ingrained in a lot of companies,
Mhm.
and there are some great companies out there that don't have that extra layer because
Yeah.
it's really already embedded and ingrained, especially the smaller companies or the mid-sized companies as you mentioned.
Yep.
They don't have an innovation department because innovation is just built into the core.
They have to, right? I
What
mean,
are
that's how they compete with companies that are like 10 times their size.
Exactly. Now, the question is, now let's think about it from both sides. From the mid-sized company, the team there is smaller, so it's
Yep.
easier to kind of involve everyone. But what are some of the best practices that you would suggest? I mean, a big part of your
Yeah.
role is to go and get buy-in within the
Yeah.
organization. So, and there's legal, there's
Yep.
compliance, there's procurement, there is brand, there's patient services.
Well, and
So,
it's
what
not
are
just,
some of the best practices there? Yeah.
yeah, so you talked about all the various functions. And I'd also like to add there's another sort of axis of complexity, which is at the country level, right? So far too often, we'll typically see a digital health strategy probably sold by, by a very expensive team of either consultants or external experts, KOLs, what have you, that are kind of forced down the throats of the people at the working level, right? So people at the country level that are basically told, all right, this is what we're doing, make this work. And it's got to be a little bit more interactive than that. I think you have to take the on the ground realities into account. You have to take the on not just in terms of the external market, but also the specific dynamics of that country business unit. That's really how you're going to get them to be really organically excited about something and really take it on, right? Because otherwise, it's my role and the role of I think anyone who's trying to bring these kinds of technologies in is really about getting people excited and almost convincing them that it was their idea in the first place. Which sounds which sounds
Exactly.
which sounds
Exactly.
silly, but it's got to be a lot more interactive. So I don't look at it as, oh, I see something cool on the outside. Let me see who internally can adopt this, right? Ideally, there's this interactive conversation going on where once you have a good sense of the needs both at the country level and then also at the function level, right? And this depends on whether are you looking for a vendor type solution or are you looking for something to commercialize. But then when you see something out there that meets that, ideally the foundation's already been laid for you to to bring that in. So the metric that I like to use is it's got to be something that if you bring it in, someone all the way up to the GM level is going to buy into.
So you're putting a pretty high bar,
Yeah.
on whoever the champion is that really identified the opportunity, to tell them, hey, it's all your legwork right now to go and get buy-in, and not just get buy-in, but get
Well,
everybody excited about this, and this is beyond your day job.
Well, so it's funny you mention that. I actually don't see my role or people in roles like me as a champion at all, right? At the end of the day, I got no budget, right? My job
People
is
who are listening, Ameya has no budget. Do not don't waste your time.
no, but I think pragmatically speaking, right? I think what you have to do, and this is not specific to any of the companies here, um, the role of people to bring in sort of external innovations, not just digital ones, right, is to convince, or not even to convince, it's really to work with the people who are under the gun to actually do the commercial activities or to actually deliver value to the companies to make it work. So it's almost like your goal is really being an advisor as opposed to being a champion. Um, and so your role should really be to help the external companies um, get favor with the people who actually have the ability to serve as those champions. And I think having a little bit of humility goes a long way in that aspect.
And this is in both directions. It's basically every conversation starts with how can I help you? Whether you are
Right.
inside the company or are you external company, like how can I help you? And then kind of see, well, if I help you, is that going to help somebody else? Tell me a little bit about communication, and we're going to wrap up after that. But in terms of communication, kind of best practices, who to engage earlier, who to engage later, how to set expectations, uh, tell us a little bit about kind of your best practices from your point of view, the best mindset.
There's a lot. I mean, so I'm going to focus specifically on people who are at the large company and whose role it is to bring in external partners. I think number one, you have to figure out, is this so, what the need is, and then does this need map to something that your company would use for its own sort of internal activities? Or is this something that your company may say commercialize, right? Or deploy in a commercial setting? Because the kind of stakeholders that you bring in are going to be completely different, right? So for example, does this map to a specific pharma brand? At that point, you probably want to get the pharma franchise, the whatever the franchise or the brand is involved, right? I think you really have to map out what this actually means, and more importantly, what's the metric by which this partnership would deliver ROI, right? So would it actually bring in revenue? Is it going to save something? Save expenses, make things whatever it is, right? And I mean, this isn't specific to say pharma and digital health, right? I mean, this is pretty classic B2B commercial as B2B sales. But it's really about mapping who is most impacted by this, and then do they care about the kind of problem this is solving. So
And this, yeah, and this is really a great point because okay, in which it makes me wonder about articulating that ROI from all the companies you see, and you see a lot of companies. Uh, what makes the one that really stand out? What is that there? Is it that they're able to point a pain point, or is it their approach? You wrote a little bit in the cyclica relationship that
yeah,
they really treated you as an kind of a advisor almost. But
yeah,
if you look at them broadly, what should someone who is going to the next startup health festival, hopefully in person, should be? What's the filter that they should be looking for?
I don't really know that they're. It's going to be tough for me to say if there's a filter or not. I mean, I think the most important things to think about are really just I think being able to articulate what problem you solve and actually doing the prospecting ahead of time so that ideally when you speak to somebody, you already know what problem they're having and you're making. I think the other part also is making the articulation that problem as specific and as tangible as possible to the person that you're speaking to, right? So when you're speaking, for example, to a person at a pharma company, not just saying, we sell a solution that solves problem XYZ, but specifically talking about a specific what that problem looks like for that company, right? So, you know, your patent on drug XYZ is running out. You're running out of assets in this therapeutic area. We can mine data, and guess what? We have these data sets in that therapeutic area. Blah blah blah. Making the problem as real as possible, and even just saying, look, even being able to show that you've done your homework and you understand their business. Right now, from the large company side, the mindset should be, I don't think it's a bad thing at all just to speak to a bunch of companies, to understand what's out there. But I think what you want to do is have a very clear set of goals on, sort of informing yourself about the market and what's going on, and then informing yourself about what problems to solve. Try not to mix the two, because it's very
That's a
difficult to do.
great.
It's very, and different people have different styles. That's just one thing that I've found. Going into every single meeting, I like to think through: am I meeting with this company to learn more about the space? How can I provide hopefully what's a meaningful interaction to that company? Or do I see a tangible potential opportunity to dive in? And I would, I think, just to go one step further, settings like the Startup Health Festival or JP Morgan, like these large, massive conferences, my personal preference is not to necessarily use that for an initial meeting, right? So ideally, identifying beforehand, having that initial conversation over the phone, learning a little bit more about each other. And then that way, when you meet in person, you're able to use that time more effectively and really dive in deep in terms of what the solution actually looks like, what can actually solve. So I personally don't favor the sort of speed dating format that sometimes people, the 5-10 minutes here in meetings here and there as an initial meeting.
Oh my God!
Um,
Everybody is thinking back of J.P. Morgan and that speed dating.
It may be. I mean, I know certain people that it works well for, but
Yeah.
from my perspective, I rather than taking on 100 meetings in 3 days, I much rather prefer to take on 100 calls in the, say, month leading up to JP Morgan, figure out which 7, 8 companies or five to six companies are the most interesting, and then being able to spend like an hour with each one, taking advantage of the fact that they're there in person. I don't have to fly to like 7 different places. So I,
That's
I
a great
prefer
point.
I prefer quality over quantity, but again, people, I think it just comes down to what's driving your activities and what works best for you. But I found so
Awesome.
far, every single partnership I've done has resulted from that week in some way, shape, or form. So
Yep. Cool. Awesome. Well, last question. Last question, and then we'll wrap up. So 2020 has been a year of advances and significant obstacles in our industry. If you could kind of time travel back to January, JP Morgan, before COVID hit, to kind of launch a timely partnership, what would it be, or with whom?
yeah, so I'm going to make a comment about the industry in general. I actually really wish the industry took human behavior a little bit more, or targeted intervention for human behavior a little bit more seriously, because think of all the challenges that we've run into with COVID. A lot of it stems from human behavior and the fact that there's all these behavioral consequences to this lockdown that we'll probably only see the real results of
Absolutely.
over years, right? And so if we had actually paid attention to have these scalable solutions, which have always been there, by the way, those solutions didn't magically just materialize in March. So I think if we had taken behavioral intervention, and I don't just mean mental health and psychiatric disorders, I mean actually looking at human behavior as a legitimate treatment modality. I think if we had taken that a little bit more seriously as a space in March, we'd have had the solutions ready to deploy when this thing hit. Um, and I honestly think that going after that would have actually addressed a lot of the, I guess, a lot of the non-pharmacological challenges we're running into right now. And I believe that there is a lot of value to be had there. So, people are wising up to it. Better late than never. We're starting to see a lot of that work being done now. But I just really, mental health is something that in general is an area that is unfortunately very underserved. And so I kind of wish that people had taken more focus and looking at that as a real commercial opportunity, so that we would have had a lot of those systems, not just having the solutions in place, but have sort of consumer acceptance of those solutions in place by, by now.
And consumer and provider. I remember.
Consumer and provider.
I remember one quote that really stuck with me. I think it was either from a health system. I think from a health system. They said we achieved in the past 2 months what we haven't been able to achieve in the past 20
10
years.
years. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's
Yeah. So
one thing
so
I
I
do.
think that's yeah.
I mean, one thing I do hope is, obviously, given the situation, there's a lot of, it's like, a lot of this sort of getting the nose to the grindstone. I mean, I remember seeing, we haven't, for all the other societal challenges we're seeing. I mean, I think looking at the progress the healthcare system is making just because it's forced to do so is quite heartening. I hope that it's not a flash in the pan, because there are some genuinely positive improvements in practice that we've unfortunately been forced to do. Um, but who knows what the future will hold. But I really hope
Exactly.
this focus on making mental health resources available and accessible without at the point of care is something that we really continue doing, and it's something that gains more acceptance as something that's real and it works as opposed to just a gadget.
Yeah, and I think we're going to be talking much more on this podcast and other places about how the meeting patients where they are
Yep.
paradigm is evolving, how what beyond the pill means now, and
Yep.
in the new kind of age of people really being somewhere, not physically. Physically, they're
Yeah.
somewhere,
I mean,
and you got to really
right. I mean,
meet them
far
where
too
they are.
often I think far too often, right? We as an industry have looked at patients as a set of organ systems, right? So you have pharmacological therapy that
Exactly.
treats the diseased tissue or what have you, but you really have to think through the fact that human behavior in most therapeutic areas is a massive driver of outcomes, and there have been a number of studies that have shown this, right? And so I think as an industry, the more seriously we take the behavioral side of treatment, um, the better it'll be, honestly.
All right, that's a great takeaway for us. Take the behavioral side of treatment more seriously. It's a call to action to everyone, to all of us. Ameya, I want to say big thank you
Thanks for having me.
for joining us on our inaugural podcast of this series at the Help Around Specialty Patient podcast series, and we are excited to start this series and have many more interesting guests. Reach out to us. We are podcast at helparound.co, and I'm enjoying my new role as a podcast host. I always knew that healthcare startup CEO never really worked out for me, so I have my new career now. So thanks everyone for being with us today, and Ameya, thanks again, and good luck to all of us in handling this this period of challenge and growth. Thank you.